Josephine Barlow was 27 years old, and she'd never told a lie that mattered until the night she told one to a dying woman. She was a legal secretary on the 12th floor of Castellano Holdings, and at 8 o'clock that evening, she was sitting on the floor of the records room in a navy blouse she'd worn 3 days running, her dark hair pulled back, her left hand resting in her lap the way it always did, the last 2 fingers curled in and refusing to straighten. On the phone with her younger sister, she kept whispering the same sentence over and over, the way you whisper something you already know you can't fix. I need a fiancé before tomorrow. Her grandmother was on the 4th floor of St. Aloysius Hospital, with weeks left, and at 10 o'clock the next morning, that old woman was expecting to finally meet him. There was no him. There never had been. Behind Josie on the floor sat an open storage box from a law firm that had closed its doors years ago, and she'd been hunting for that box for over a year without ever telling a living soul why. She hadn't had time to look inside yet. She hung up, wiped her face, turned around, and walked straight into the chest of a black 3-piece suit. Salvatore Castellano was 34. He owned the building she was standing in. He owned the waterfront, and most of what moved across it. And men in that city lowered their voices when he passed them in a hallway. He didn't say a word. He looked at her for 3 full seconds, then looked past her shoulder at the open box on the floor. And then he stepped around her and kept walking. Josie stood there until the motion lights shut themselves off, certain she'd just lost the only job keeping her family afloat. She spent that whole night rehearsing how to confess. But at 9:50 the next morning, 3 black SUVs pulled into the visitor lot at St. Aloysius. 2 men in dark coats got out first. Then Salvatore Castellano crossed the cold pavement, walked directly to her, took hold of her left hand, the hand she'd hidden from every living soul since the winter that took her parents, and said quietly, "I'm sorry I'm late." Josie forgot how to breathe, because a man like that doesn't do a favor for a woman like her without a reason. And his reason had nothing to do with kindness. If this story moves you the way it moved me, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Your support is what keeps stories like this one alive. Now let's go inside that hospital and find out why the most dangerous man in Boston walked through those doors. The door to room 412 opened at 5 minutes to 10, and Winifred Barlow looked up with the face of a woman who had spent the entire morning preparing herself for the worst. All morning she had told herself that she wouldn't cry. She had already decided what she would say when the girl walked in alone, how she would take her hand, how she would tell her that she wasn't angry, that she only wanted to hear the truth once before she could no longer hear anything at all. She had asked Father Doyle to come early and sit in the corner so there would be a witness, because she knew how stubborn her granddaughter was, and she knew that in front of a priest, the girl would have a much harder time continuing that lie. She had arranged everything. She had thought of everything. Except this. Josie walked in first, and directly behind her came a tall man in a black 3-piece suit, entering that cramped hospital room the way a man might enter his own conference room. Miss Winnie pushed herself straighter against the pillows. Father Doyle stood, and for a long, uncomfortable moment, no one in the room said anything. "Grandma," Josie began, her voice thin as paper. "This is Salvatore Castellano," the man said, and he stepped forward and offered the old woman his hand. Not the kind of handshake people exchange out of politeness, but the kind of hand a person offers someone he knows he may not have many chances to meet again. Miss Winnie reached out. Her hand was light and cold, the knuckles swollen from all the years she had spent holding needles, and she kept hold of his hand a little longer than necessary. "You are," she began, then stopped. "I'm her employer," he said. "That's how we met." Josie felt the entire room tilt slightly beneath her feet. Father Doyle cleared his throat. Miss Winnie didn't blink once. "Her employer," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am, and she has never once agreed to tell me what kind of work you do. I think that was wise of her." Miss Winnie let out a small sound that wasn't quite laughter, and told him to pull his chair closer. He did. He sat beside her bed with both hands resting on his knees, and he never once looked around the room, not at the IV stand, not at the oxygen tubing, not at the whiteboard with the nurse's name written across it. He looked only at her. Josie stood at the foot of the bed and waited for disaster to come. She had imagined this scene 100 times during the night, except that in every version, she had been standing there alone, and her grandmother had cried. But her grandmother wasn't crying. She was doing something entirely different. She was looking down at the stranger's right hand, where a thin silver ring worn smooth around the edges rested on his ring finger, the only piece of jewelry on his body. She stared at it for a long time. Then she began asking him all kinds of things, the small questions old women ask, whether he had eaten breakfast, whether it was very cold outside, what part of the country his parents came from, and every time he answered, her eyes slipped back down to that hand again. Josie thought she was becoming emotional. She thought that at last her grandmother had been given the one thing she had longed for so deeply, that she was trying to memorize this man's face so she could carry it with her. And the thought tightened Josie's throat so badly that she had to turn away and look through the window. But her grandmother wasn't emotional at all. She was trying to remember something sitting right at the edge of memory like a thread that had slipped from the eye of a needle, so close that she could almost touch it, and yet she couldn't reach it. Father Doyle excused himself after about 15 minutes. The old priest patted Josie's shoulder in the hallway and said a few kind things she didn't hear a single word of, because there was only one sentence repeating itself inside her head, over and over, that she had just allowed her lie to grow another pair of legs, that it was no longer something between her and her grandmother, that now it had a name, a face, and a man whose presence made an entire city lower its voice when he passed. When she went back inside, her grandmother was laughing with him about something, and Salvatore was holding the glass of water from the bedside table, adjusting the straw so it reached comfortably to her mouth, doing it neatly and skillfully, as though he had done it many times before in his life, somewhere else, for someone else. By noon, the nurse wheeled in the lunch cart, and Miss Winnie absolutely insisted that both of them stay and eat with her. "The girl is too thin," she said, "and you probably haven't had a thing all morning." "I already ate, ma'am." "You lie worse than my granddaughter does." And so the man who ruled the harbor district sat down on a plastic chair beside the hospital bed, peeled the foil from a meal tray, and began eating soft beef stew with a plastic fork. Josie sat across from him and didn't dare look up. "Mr. Castellano." "Yes, ma'am." "How long have you known my girl?" "Not long enough." "That sounds like a very clever answer." "I know, ma'am." Miss Winnie pointed her fork at him. "My grandmother used to say that anyone who answers too smoothly is either truly in love or trying to sell you something." She was right. "So which one are you?" He set down his fork. "I haven't tried to sell you anything yet." Josie lightly kicked him beneath the bed. He didn't move at all. Miss Winnie looked from one of them to the other, and Josie had the uncomfortable feeling that her grandmother could see far more than what was actually in the room. "She's been telling me about you for 2 years, Miss Winnie said, "and somehow she hasn't told me anything." "I have told you things, Grandma. You told me he's busy. You told me he travels for work. You told me he doesn't like having his picture taken." Miss Winnie gave a little snort. "You've been telling me about a shadow, sweetheart." Josie lowered her eyes to her lunch tray. "All right," the old woman said, her voice softening a little. "Then I'll ask directly. What does my granddaughter like about you?" The entire room went silent. Josie looked up and found Salvatore watching her, waiting, and she realized immediately that he wasn't going to rescue her from this one. She began. "Yes, he's punctual." Miss Winnie blinked. "Punctual. Yes. He respects people's time. And what else? And he's organized." Miss Winnie put down her fork with the expression of a woman who had just heard the most ridiculous thing in her life. "Josephine Barlow, you're describing a subway train, sweetheart." And then Josie heard a sound she had never heard in more than a year of working in that building. A laugh. Very quiet, very brief, almost nothing more than a breath escaping from his throat. But it was real, and it came from the man sitting beside her grandmother's bed eating beef stew with a plastic fork. She turned sharply toward him. He had already recovered his usual expression, but not quickly enough. "You think that's funny?" she asked. "A little. You're not allowed to laugh. Then you should stop talking." Miss Winnie slapped one hand against the blanket, openly delighted. "There," she said to Josie. "That is something worth telling me. Not that he's punctual." Lunch lasted another half-hour or so, and Miss Winnie managed to extract more information from him than an entire interrogation room might have. She learned that he couldn't stand sweet coffee. She learned that he had no brothers or sisters. She learned that his mother had died many years ago, and that his father had followed not long afterward. And when she asked about that, he answered with one short sentence and stopped, and the old woman was wise enough not to press further. Josie sat quietly listening, thinking over and over that this was a man who could step out of an elevator and make 20 people on an entire floor fall silent without anyone being told. And yet here he was, allowing an Irish woman in her 70s to question him about his private life without showing even a second of irritation. Before they left, the nurse returned to collect the trays, and Miss Winnie stopped her and handed over her old phone. "Take a picture for me, Grandma. I don't have a single one." So they stood beside each other at the foot of the bed. Josie went rigid as a post. Salvatore placed one hand against her back, very lightly, not holding her, not tightening his grip, simply resting it there. She looked up at him by reflex. And that was the exact moment the picture was taken. In the photograph, neither of them was smiling at the camera. She was looking up at him. He was looking down at her. Miss Winnie took the phone and studied the picture for a very long time, much longer than anyone would normally study a photograph. Then she turned off the screen, opened the drawer of the bedside table, placed the phone inside, and said nothing at all. Once they were out in the hallway, Josie waited until the door had closed completely before turning to him. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that. I don't know what I could possibly say that would be enough." He didn't answer. "But you can go now. You've done more than anyone had the right to ask of you. I'll handle the rest myself." "What is the rest?" "I'm going to tell my grandmother the truth. Not today, but I will tell her." "When?" She opened her mouth and then stopped, because the only honest answer was that she didn't know, and she had made that promise to herself so many times that it no longer meant anything. He looked through the narrow opening in the doorway toward the room, where the old woman was still struggling with the bed control, trying to raise the backrest. "You said you needed a fiancé for tomorrow," he said. "Yes, today isn't over yet." He said it in exactly the tone someone might use to read a line from a contract, then pushed the door open and walked back into the room, leaving Josie alone in the hallway with the strange sensation that someone had just lifted her completely off the ground. The night before, that same man had been standing in a windowless room in the basement of the Castellano Holdings building. There was a long table in the room, a dock manager named Renner, and Angelo Ruzzo leaning with his back against the wall. Salvatore didn't raise his voice. He pulled out a chair, sat down, opened a file, and began reading in the flat, even tone of a man reciting a price list. He read Renner's account balance. He read the mortgage on the house south of the city, including the date Renner had first fallen behind and the interest that had accumulated since then. He read out 3 deposits made into Renner's account during the previous 3 months, and then he read the name of the person who had sent them. At that point, Renner seemed to collapse into his chair. You don't need to explain. Mr. Castellano, I swear. You don't need to swear either." Salvatore closed the file. "I've known about this for 3 weeks. I left it alone for 3 weeks because I wanted to see whether you would come to me on your own. You didn't." Renner couldn't say anything. "You keep the house," Salvatore said. "I won't touch it, but tomorrow morning you leave this state, and I don't want to hear your name again for the rest of my life." He looked at his watch. "You have 4 minutes to get out of this building." Renner stood, the chair scraping across the concrete floor, and walked out without daring to look back. The door closed. Angelo remained against the wall. "Your father wouldn't have let him walk away," Angelo said. "I know. Your father would have done something else." "I know." Salvatore stood and fastened the button of his jacket again. "That's why I'm not my father." Angelo was silent for a moment, then took a thin file from inside his coat and placed it on the table. "What's this?" "The girl from the records room tonight. You told me to look into her." Salvatore picked it up. He read quickly, the way a man reads when he is accustomed to going through hundreds of pages a day and knows exactly where to stop. "Legal secretary, employed for more than a year. Not 1 vacation day taken. Not 1 sick day. A request to adjust her work schedule so she could take a second job in the evenings at a laundromat outside the city. Approved. 1 younger sister, in her final year of school. Parents deceased. The only remaining relative listed in her personnel records was her grandmother, and beside the old woman's name was an emergency contact address, St. Aloysius Hospital, 4th floor, room 412. Salvatore lowered the page onto the table and sat in silence for a very long time. On Tuesday morning, Josie stood in front of the elevator that led to the records floor and swiped her employee badge across the reader. The light turned red. She swiped it again. Still red. She had known it would be red. She had known that for more than a year, and yet every morning when she passed this elevator, she tried once anyway. The way people keep pressing an elevator button even after the light has already come on. A legal secretary's badge opened the office floors, the parking garage, the cafeteria. It didn't open the 39th floor. She slipped the badge back into her pocket and walked to her desk, and not one person in that building knew that she had applied for the job, not because of the salary, not because of the company name printed on the business card, but because of a single blacked-out line. That winter, after everything was over, after her father had been buried and her mother had held on for another 3 weeks before following him, after 4 surgeries and months spent learning how to hold a spoon again, they sent her a copy of the case file. She had read it so many times that she knew every line by heart. The defendant had accepted responsibility. The defendant had paid compensation. The matter had been closed through a civil settlement, and that settlement carried 3 signatures. The first was her attorney's. The second belonged to the attorney on the other side. The third had been blacked out. She had asked about it. She asked her lawyer, who told her it was standard procedure, that certain involved parties had the right to keep their identities confidential in publicly released records. She asked the court, and they told her to file a request for access to the record. She filed it. The request was denied. She filed again. Denied again. Then she ran out of money for lawyers, and eventually she ran out of strength to keep asking, and that blacked-out line sat inside her desk drawer for years, like a splinter no one could see, until the day she learned that the law office, representing the other side, had dissolved. It took her months just to discover what had happened to their archive. The answer was that it hadn't gone anywhere at all. It had been sold along with the building, together with several thousand boxes of documents that had never been digitized. And the company that purchased that building was Castellano Holdings. Josie applied for a job the following week. She knew nothing about the man who owned the place. She didn't care. All she knew was that whatever remained from the night that had taken both her parents from her was sitting inside cardboard boxes on the 39th floor, and she would do anything to stand close enough to reach them. The only problem was that her badge didn't open that floor. A few times each month, when one of the company lawyers needed an old file pulled, a secretary would be asked to go along, and someone else would open the door for her. On those occasions, she had about half an hour, sometimes less, and while the other person searched for whatever they needed, Josie walked the rows of shelves reading the labels on every box, memorizing them, then went home at night and drew the layout again in a notebook she hid at the bottom of her closet. Nell didn't know. Her grandmother knew even less. For more than a year, Josie searched one box at a time during those brief stolen windows, and some nights when she lay down, she wondered whether she was doing something insane, whether that name was worth everything she had traded to find it, and the answer was always the same. Because she didn't need the name for anything at all. She simply needed to know. And on the night her grandmother called to tell her about the following morning, the night Josie sank onto the floor of the records room with the phone pressed to her ear, she had just found it. The final box, on the final shelf, labeled with the exact year and the exact name of that law office. She had pulled it from the shelf and lifted the lid. She hadn't even had time to take anything out before she turned around, and the man who owned the entire building was standing directly behind her, looking over her shoulder at the open box. The following Monday morning, Josie was standing in the photocopy area at the far end of the 12th floor hallway, the place everyone on the floor jokingly called the dead corner, because the machine was always jamming and no one ever bothered to fix it. When she heard the conversation outside suddenly stop, she looked up. Salvatore Castellano was standing in the doorway. In more than a year of working in that building, she had never once seen him set foot on the 12th floor. Not once. People went upstairs to see him. He didn't come down. "Your grandmother called me," he said. Josie froze with a stack of papers in her hands. "My grandmother did what?" "She called me. Yesterday. Where did she get your number?" "I gave it to her." Josie closed her eyes for 1 second. "Why did you give my grandmother your number?" "She asked for it." He said it as though that were a complete explanation for everything in the world. "What did she say to you?" "She asked what I like to eat. She said the hospital kitchen is making stew for her this Sunday." Josie set the papers down. "You told her no, right?" "I did." "Thank you. Then I moved a meeting." She turned sharply toward him. "You did what?" "I had a meeting at the harbor Sunday afternoon. I moved it to Tuesday." A long silence settled over the cramped corner filled with the smell of printer ink. Josie had worked in that building long enough to know that the schedule of the man standing in front of her was divided into 15-minute blocks, that some people waited months just to be given one of those blocks, and that no one had ever heard of him moving a meeting for a personal reason. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. My grandmother is going to think this is real." "Your grandmother already thinks it is." He turned and walked away before she could say anything else, and the entire 12th floor remained completely silent until the elevator doors closed. No one asked her a single question for the rest of the day, but she could feel their eyes on the back of her neck every time she got up to get water. The next morning, when Josie arrived at work and switched on her desk lamp, a cardboard box was sitting neatly in the middle of her desk. She looked around. No one appeared to be paying attention to her. She opened it. Inside was a split keyboard, the two halves angled outward, with a soft, fabric-covered wrist rest running along the front, the kind made specifically for office workers with tendon injuries who couldn't type comfortably on an ordinary keyboard. It cost several times more than the black plastic keyboard the company issued to every employee. There was no card, no sender's name, no handwritten note, only a folded delivery slip at the bottom of the box, printed in the same lifeless font the administrative department always used. And on the note line, there was a single sentence: assistive equipment per employee request. Josie sat down. She had never made a request. She had never submitted any form, never mentioned it to administration, never said a word about it to anyone in that building. Because on the day of her interview, she had told herself that if they knew, they wouldn't hire her, and if they hired her first and found out later, they would look at her differently. For more than a year, she had arrived 15 minutes before everyone else and stayed 15 minutes later to make up for the speed she lacked, and she had believed no one had noticed. She sat there staring at the open box on her desk for so long that her computer screen went to sleep. Then she folded her arms on the desk and lowered her face into them. Camille Ashford's hand tightened around the edge of the table when she heard that surname. Say that again. Barlow. Josephine Barlow, legal secretary on the 12th floor. The woman sitting across from her in the ground floor cafe was a mid-level human resources employee, one of several people in the building who still received small, regular transfers from an account that didn't carry Camille's name. He went all the way down to the 12th floor, the woman continued, lowering her voice. The whole floor saw him. Then the next day, a box was delivered to her desk, and it didn't go through the company's normal purchasing system. Camille said nothing. She finished the cold coffee in her cup, set it down, and told the woman to leave first. Then she remained there alone in the cafe for almost another hour. She had known that surname for a long time. She had known it from the exact day someone sent her the quarterly list of new employees, a list no one had required her to read. And she had read it out of the habit of someone born into a family that taught its children that the most dangerous thing in the world was a name you didn't recognize. Except that time, she did recognize it. She had sat in front of that sheet for a very long time, exactly the way she was sitting now. Then she started looking into it. She knew where Josephine Barlow lived, which bus route she took to work, which evenings she worked a second job at the laundromat outside the city. She knew the girl had a younger sister in her final year of school and a grandmother in the hospital. She knew Josie volunteered to stay after hours whenever someone needed an old file pulled, and she knew exactly what that archive contained. For 14 months, everyone had assumed that the girl was quietly searching for something inside this building. The truth was that there was a woman who had been quietly watching the girl search from the very first day, and that woman knew perfectly well where the thing she was looking for was. There had been one time when Camille had considered ending the matter once and for all. It happened during the summer of the previous year, in the office on the top floor, when she came to have lunch with Salvatore according to the schedule both families had arranged for them. She let the conversation drift for a few minutes, before dropping the subject in as casually as possible. I heard there's an employee on the 12th floor who's been causing problems. What kind of problems? I only heard about it secondhand. Conduct issues. Staying in the building after hours. Salvatore set down his knife and fork. He didn't ask another question. He reached for the office phone, made one short call, and less than 2 minutes later, someone brought up a personnel file. Camille remembered very clearly how she had felt in that moment, the sense of victory coming so easily that it was almost boring, because she had believed he would sign one thing and it would all be over. He didn't sign anything. He opened the file and read. He read for much longer than she had expected. Then he closed it, pushed it aside, and looked up at her. She comes to work every day. She hasn't missed a single shift, not one sick day. Salvatore, her request to change shifts is in here. She stays after hours because someone asks her to stay. He tapped one finger against the cover of the file exactly once. Give me a real reason. Camille opened her mouth. Then she closed it again. Because she did have a real reason. A very real one. A reason so complete that if she spoke the first 3 words of it, everything in her life would collapse right there across that lunch table. She smiled, said she must have heard something wrong somewhere, and changed the subject to the autumn fundraiser. Salvatore never brought it up again. Neither he nor the girl on the 12th floor ever knew that on one summer afternoon, that man had saved Josephine Barlow once already simply by refusing to sign his name. And now, sitting alone in the ground floor cafe with an empty cup in front of her, Camille Ashford realized that everything had changed. He had gone down to the 12th floor. He had moved a meeting. The woman tightened her hand again, and this time she couldn't hide the thing she had concealed so well for 14 months. The thing no one in that building had ever seen on her face before. She was afraid. The insurance company's letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, and it was written in language so polite that Josie had to read it twice before she understood what they were actually saying. End-of-life care at a private facility would no longer be covered, beginning with the next benefit period. Beneath that was a recommendation that the patient be transferred to the nearest public facility with an available bed, followed by an address for a place 90 minutes outside the city. Josie finished reading, folded the letter, slipped it into her pocket, and sat motionless at the kitchen table until Nell came home. That night, Nell set the laptop down in front of her sister and signed clearly, without hesitation or preamble. I'm taking this semester off. I'll work. I'll go back next year. No. Josie. I said no. Josie stood before her sister could sign another word, walked into the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and stayed there until she was certain her face looked normal again. The next day at work, she carried her phone into the restroom at the far end of the hallway, locked herself inside a stall, called the hospital finance office, and listened while someone told her the amount the family would have to pay if they wanted to keep her grandmother where she was. She thanked them very politely, ended the call, then sat down on the closed toilet seat with one hand clamped tightly over her mouth so no one outside could hear her. She cried for about 4 minutes. Then she washed her face, touched up her makeup, and returned to her desk exactly when the lunch break ended. On Monday morning, the hospital called. She had already prepared herself to hear the date of the transfer, so it took her a moment to understand what they were telling her. Winifred Barlow's case had just been approved for a special assistance fund for elderly patients in exceptional circumstances. The full cost of her stay and care would be covered for as long as necessary. The family didn't need to do anything else. Josie asked for the name of the fund. They gave her something that sounded painfully administrative, almost deliberately anonymous. She asked who was behind it. They told her they didn't have that information. That afternoon, she went to the top floor without asking anyone's permission. Angela Russo rose from the desk outside, looked at her, then sat back down and didn't stop her. She pushed open the door and walked in. Salvatore was standing beside the window with a file in his hand. He didn't look surprised. I know it was you, she said. He set the file down. That fund isn't real. Or maybe it is real, but it has never approved anyone that quickly in its entire existence. Did you come here to ask? Or to give it back? I came to ask what you want. Nothing. No one gives anyone something for nothing. True, but I didn't give it to you. Josie stood still. I'm not buying you, he said. I'm buying time for her. Do you think I'm that cheap? No. He turned and looked at her for the first time since she had entered the room. I think time costs more than you realize. There was something in the way he said it that left her unable to answer immediately. She had prepared an entire speech in her head, had rehearsed it all the way down the hallway, about pride, about how she had never begged anyone for anything, about how she would manage somehow even if it meant taking a third job, and all of it suddenly sounded hollow inside her own mind. Do you know what's going to happen? She asked, her voice lowering. My grandmother is going to think this happened because you care about her. She'll believe that story I made up even more. And when the truth finally comes apart, I'm the one who will have to sit there and watch her hurt, not you. I know. Then why did you still do it? He didn't answer. He looked out the window toward the harbor and remained silent long enough for her to understand that he wasn't going to answer that question today. If you want to give it back, he finally said, you'll have to tell the hospital, not me, and you'll have to decide for yourself how many weeks your pride is worth. Josie stood there a little longer. Then she turned and walked out, and she never said a word to the hospital. On the way to the elevator that afternoon, Josie took the wrong hallway. The top floor split into 2 wings, and the one on the right led to a row of closed doors she had never seen anyone open. One of them stood ajar by about a handspan. She stopped. She should have kept walking. Instead, she pushed the door open. Inside was an empty room. No desks, no chairs, no filing cabinets, nothing that belonged in an office building. There was only a grand piano in the center of the room, completely covered by a dark cloth that had gathered dust. The lid was closed. Beside it were 2 piano benches, one tucked close to the instrument, the other pushed a little farther away, as though someone had pulled it back once and walked away without ever returning to put it in place. You took the wrong hallway. Josie turned. He was standing in the doorway, still holding the file he had carried earlier. I'm sorry. I thought this was the way out. He said nothing about that. He stepped inside, walked past her, and stopped several feet from the piano without going any closer. My mother taught piano, he said. Josie remained still. She taught at a church in the North End. Children from the neighborhood, children of fishermen, children of men who repaired boats. She didn't charge most of them. He looked at the cloth covering the piano. Every year she held a recital for the children. At the last one, she said she was tired and that she would sit down and play one piece for them instead. She called me 3 days before. She asked if I could come. Did you? I told her I would. He paused. I had a meeting at the harbor that evening. I planned to do both. The meeting ran longer than I expected. Josie didn't ask anything else. She didn't need to. She died that same night, he said, after everyone else had gone home. They told me she stayed behind alone on the bench to the left of the piano, the place where she always sat when she taught, leaving the right side open for the student. He tipped his chin slightly toward the bench that had been pushed away. I bought the piano afterward. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just didn't want anyone else to buy it. A very long silence settled over the room. Then he turned toward her. That night I went up to the 39th floor to retrieve a file, he said. I heard you talking on the phone. I recognized that sound. What sound? The sound of someone trying to bargain with time. He said it in the calmest voice imaginable. And that was exactly what sent a chill through her. I lost that bargain once, he said. I know what it sounds like. Josie had to look at the floor for a while before she could speak. So that's what this was, she said. You came to the hospital because of that, not because of me. No, thank you for telling me the truth. I have no reason to lie to you. He placed the file on top of the covered piano, then asked her something no one in that building had ever asked. Why do you never take your left hand out of your pocket? Josie went completely still. In more than a year there, she had prepared answers for every kind of question. Curious questions, pitying questions, questions people deliberately asked in front of others. She had never prepared for this kind, direct and without pity, asked as simply as someone asking about a fact. That winter, she said, my family was driving home from dinner. Another car came toward us from the opposite direction. She stopped. My father died that night. My mother held on for another 3 weeks. She could hear how calm her own voice sounded, and it surprised her. I sat in the waiting room outside surgery long enough to memorize every crack in the ceiling. People kept coming in and out, calling other names. Never mine. Then a nurse brought me one of those hospital plastic bags with the zipper across the top. My mother's wedding ring was inside. They had to take it off her for the scans. Josie drew in a breath. They operated on my hand 4 times. And after the last surgery, the doctor told me he had done everything he could and that I needed to start learning how to live with this hand instead of waiting for it to become what it used to be. You studied piano. Her head snapped up. How do you know? The way you looked at the piano when you walked into this room. No one stares at a covered piano that long unless it means something to them. Josie was silent for a long time. I studied at the conservatory, she said. My final year. I had a recital scheduled that spring. She gave a very small shrug. The school held my place for 2 semesters. By the 3rd, they stopped. And the man? Grant. She said the name as though she were reading the label on a bottle of medicine. He came to see me at the hospital twice. The second time, he didn't stay long. A few days later, I got a message. What did it say? He apologized. He said he wasn't strong enough for this. Josie gave a dry little laugh. That was the last thing he ever said to me. I thought about it for a long time. And eventually I had to admit that at least he was honest. Salvatore said nothing. He didn't look at her with pity. Didn't tell her he was sorry. Didn't tell her she was strong. He simply stood there with her in the room with the covered piano and the bench pushed away until she found her breath again. Salvatore turned a page in the file and stopped. It was close to midnight. 3 cardboard boxes from the 39th floor sat on his desk. The ones he had told Angelo to bring upstairs immediately after that afternoon in the room with the piano. And he had been reading ever since the building was still lit, until the only light left was the lamp on his own desk. He wasn't searching for the accident. He only wanted to know what that girl had spent more than a year inside his building trying to find. And now he was holding it in his hands. A stamped civil settlement agreement, with 3 signatures on the final page. He read the first line, then read it again. Barlow. He turned the page. On the other side was a surname he had heard all his life. Ashford. And at the bottom corner, beside the notary seal, was the signature of a law office he didn't need to look up, because for 20 years it had worked for exactly one client, and that client had been his father. Salvatore lowered the paper onto the desk. He sat completely still. In his life, he had sat across from men carrying guns beneath their coats, had walked into rooms where everyone knew he might not walk back out, and he had never felt what was moving down his spine now. Angelo. The door opened about 10 seconds later. Angelo Ruzzo walked in, with his coat still draped over one arm, and one look at Salvatore's face was enough to make him set the coat down on a chair. You knew about this? Salvatore pushed the paper across the desk. Angelo picked it up. He read more slowly, the way an older man reads when he has no reason to hurry anymore, and Salvatore saw the exact moment recognition came, because Angelo's shoulders lowered slightly. I knew, Angelo said. Why have I never known about this? Because you never asked. Don't talk to me like that. Angelo set the paper back on the desk. That year, you were burying your mother, he said. You sat in that church for 3 days straight. Afterward, your father told you he would handle everything outside, and you let him handle it. That's what happened. Salvatore didn't answer. He was trying to remember that winter, and he couldn't remember much beyond the smell of candles inside the church and the cold in the tips of his fingers. Your father didn't take money from them, Angelo continued. Not like that. Then what was it? You know what the Ashford family has done for us all these years. I know. Then you're smart enough to answer your own question. Salvatore stood, walked to the window, and remained there looking down at the lights along the harbor, the place where everything he owned had begun. He thought about the woman sitting on the floor of the records room, with the open box behind her. He thought about more than a year of her coming to work every single day without missing one shift, simply so she could remain close to those shelves. He thought about the fact that he himself had signed the paperwork that hired her, and that he himself had refused to let her be dismissed on a summer afternoon, and suddenly he understood that all that time she had been searching for a name, hidden inside his own building, kept there because his father had wanted it kept there. She's going to ask whether I knew, he said. Angelo was silent for a moment. And what are you going to tell her? The truth. You think she'll believe you? Salvatore turned around, and for the first time in many years, Angelo Russo saw something on that man's face he had never seen, when an enemy sat across from him, something that could only appear when a person realized the danger wasn't coming from outside, but from the very name he carried. No, Salvatore said. She won't believe me, and she has every right not to. On Sunday, he arrived before the appointed time. Josie was standing at the far end of the hallway talking to the nurse on duty when she saw him walk in, carrying a bouquet of white carnations wrapped in plain paper. No ribbon, no card. She froze for a second. She had mentioned those flowers exactly once, during lunch the other day, when her grandmother had wandered into a story about her wedding and said that back then they had been poor and couldn't afford wedding flowers, so she had cut a few white carnations from the neighbor's garden and pinned them to her dress. Josie remembered that Salvatore hadn't said a single thing at the time. He handed the flowers to the old woman, and Miss Winnie took them, looked up at him for a long moment, then simply said thank you, and told Josie to go find a vase. No one explained anything further. Dinner that evening was exactly what she had promised. A tray of stew she had asked the hospital kitchen to prepare especially, and the three of them ate around the small table beside the bed. Miss Winnie ate half her portion and then stopped, and she made no attempt to hide it. She simply pushed the tray away and said that these days she mostly ate with her eyes. Afterward, she reached for the sewing basket beneath the bedside cabinet. "What are you sewing now, Grandma?" Josie asked, mending the pillowcase. "It's frayed at the corner. I'll buy you a new one tomorrow. This one still works." The old woman took out a spool of white thread and a needle and tried to thread it. She tried once, then a second time. Her hands trembled. Her knuckles had been swollen for years, and the thread kept slipping past the eye of the needle. She tried a third time, then set both things down on the blanket. "Mr. Castellano." "Yes, ma'am. Thread this for me." Josie started to reach for it, but her grandmother had already pushed the spool and needle toward the man sitting on the other side of the bed. Salvatore took them. He lifted the needle in his left hand, angled it toward the bedside lamp, then passed the end of the thread cleanly through the eye in one motion, without hesitation, without having to adjust it once. He tied a small knot at the end and held it out to the old woman. Miss Winnie didn't take it immediately. She looked at his hand. She looked for a very long time, much longer than it should have taken to accept a needle back. And Josie sat beside her without understanding what her grandmother was thinking. Then Miss Winnie took it, thanked him, and began mending the pillowcase, as though nothing had happened. Josie excused herself to get hot water for tea. When she returned, her grandmother had set the needle and thread aside, and the room had gone quiet, in the particular way a room does, when two people have just been talking about something, and stopped when a third person came back in. Miss Winnie waited until Josie had poured the tea and sat down. "Mr. Castellano." "Yes. I'm old, so forgive me if I ask directly. Ask whatever you like." The old woman looked at him through the steam rising from her cup. "How long do you intend to keep my girl?" Josie went still. "Grandma, I'm asking him, not you." Miss Winnie never took her eyes off him. "You're a good man. I can see that now. But there are two kinds of good men. There are the ones who are good because they want to stay, and there are the ones who are good because they're repaying a debt to someone who is gone." She tilted her head slightly. "Which kind are you?" Salvatore didn't answer immediately. Josie sat beside him, hearing the steady sound of the heart monitor in the corner of the room, and she realized that for the first time since the morning he had stepped out of that black car, this man didn't have an answer ready. He lifted his cup of tea. He didn't drink. Then he set it down very gently and remained silent until the old woman gave a small nod and turned to ask Josie about something else. The invitation was sent down to the 12th floor in the middle of the week, along with a note from the organizers saying that this year the company wanted representation from the administrative staff, and Josephine Barlow's name was at the top of the list. She had intended to decline. Then she thought about the hospital, about that fund, about how she owed this place more than she wanted to admit. And she went. The fundraising gala was held in the grand ballroom of an old hotel downtown, and Josie spent almost the entire first hour standing at the edge of the room with a glass of water in her hand, counting down the minutes until she could leave without anyone noticing. Camille Ashford found her just as the program moved into the speeches. "Miss Barlow, isn't it?" "Yes. Hello. I've heard a great deal about you." Camille smiled, a beautiful, flawless smile, then stepped onto the stage before Josie had a chance to answer. She took the microphone, thanked the donors, said a few words about the music scholarship fund they were raising money for that evening, then paused, as though something interesting had just occurred to her. "Actually, we're very fortunate tonight," Camille said into the microphone. "Among our guests is someone who was once an outstanding piano student at the conservatory, Miss Josephine Barlow." The entire ballroom turned toward her. "Miss Barlow, would you play something for us?" Josie stood rooted to the spot. There was scattered applause at first, then more of it. The polite applause of a room full of people who had no idea what was happening. She looked toward Camille and met the woman's eyes, and she understood immediately that this wasn't an accident, that the woman knew exactly, knew enough to choose this particular knife out of hundreds of others. If Josie refused now, the entire room would want to know why. She set down her glass of water and walked onto the stage. The piano stood at one side with its lid already open. She sat on the bench. She placed her left hand in her lap. Then she began to play with her right. She chose the simplest piece she could still remember, and by the third measure she already knew she wasn't going to make it through. There was no bass line, and the melody hung suspended in the air like a sentence left unfinished. She missed one note, then another. The rhythm began to slip. Someone coughed. Then from a table at the back of the room came a quiet laugh. Only one. Very small. But in that silence it sounded like a glass shattering. Josie didn't stop. She lowered her head and kept going, knowing her face was burning, thinking only that she had to reach the end of the piece, stand up, and walk straight out the door. Then she heard a chair scrape backward from the middle of the room. Someone was walking toward the stage. The footsteps were steady, unhurried. The entire ballroom fell silent. Salvatore Castellano stepped onto the stage without saying a word to anyone, walked around the piano, and sat down on her left. Josie looked up at him. He didn't look at her. He placed both hands over the lower keys and began playing the bass line, entering at exactly the right beat, as though he had been sitting there waiting from the beginning. The music stood up again. Josie nearly lost her place from sheer astonishment, then found the rhythm, and together they carried the piece all the way to the end. It wasn't perfect. She still missed a note in the transition, but it was a complete piece of music, with both parts intact. And not one person in that ballroom knew that this was the piece a woman in the North End had once taught to the children of fishermen, or that the man now sitting on Josie's left had not touched a piano key since the night that bench had been left empty. When the final note faded completely, no one applauded at first. Salvatore stood. He didn't take the microphone. He only spoke, his voice so quiet that the people at the tables in the back had to lean forward to hear him. "Anyone in this room who has never needed someone to sit down beside them," he said. "Please, keep laughing." No one laughed. He waited exactly one beat, then held out his hand to help Josie rise from the piano bench, and the entire ballroom stood and applauded in the way people do when they don't know what else to do. Camille Ashford was still standing at the edge of the stage, holding the microphone, now switched off. As Josie passed her, the woman tilted her head and spoke softly enough for only one person to hear, her voice still bright, as though she were offering a compliment. "You played beautifully. Truly. It's a shame everyone knows you couldn't even hold on to that hand on that rainy night. But still, I suppose tonight will be memorable." Josie kept walking. She was shaking too badly to hear the second half clearly, and she didn't care. It would be much later before she remembered those words. Camille found him in the corridor behind the ballroom, where several tables draped in white cloth had been set up for the wine service. She waited until 2 servers had disappeared before speaking. "You just humiliated me in front of 300 people. No. You left the table in the middle of the evening. You walked onto that stage. You sat down beside some hired typist from the 12th floor and let this entire city watch you do it. You did that to yourself." Camille laughed, a short, dry sound. "I did what?" "You raised a microphone and called the name of someone you knew couldn't refuse in front of a crowd. You knew she wouldn't be able to play. That's why you called her." "I was complimenting her." "You aimed directly at the place you thought she couldn't protect." Salvatore set his glass down on the table. "And you did it in front of me, at a fundraiser for music scholarships." Camille was silent for a beat. "What kind of tone are you using with me?" The same one I always use. You're defending her. I'm describing what you just did. She stepped closer, and her voice dropped, sharper now. Do you remember what we are, Salvatore? Do you remember why I have this ring on my hand? This isn't romance. It's an arrangement. 2 families. You know that better than anyone. I know. Then act like you understand your part in it. Salvatore looked at her for a moment. Then he said, very calmly, it's over. What's over? The arrangement. It's over. Camille froze. You can't be serious. I don't say things I don't intend to do. You're ending our engagement, she said, and her voice cracked slightly at the end. Because of a servant. No. He fastened the button of his jacket again. I'm ending it because I just saw how you treat someone when you believe she has no way to fight back. The corridor went completely silent. Somewhere inside the ballroom, the band began playing again. You'll regret this, Camille said. Maybe. My family won't let this go. I know. She stood there for a very long time, her chest rising and falling, then lifted one hand and removed the ring from her finger. She had to twist it twice before it came free because her hand was shaking too badly to hold steady. She placed it on the white tablecloth, not pushing it toward him, simply leaving it there before walking away. Salvatore didn't pick it up. That same night, about 4 miles from downtown, Josie finished her shift at the laundromat close to 11 o'clock. She had managed to go home after the gala, change clothes, and go to work just as she did every other Saturday night, because she had taken that shift 2 months earlier, and she had never missed one. She locked the door, pulled down the security grill, then started walking toward the bus stop. Across the street, a black sedan was parked close to the curb. Its lights were off. The engine was still running. She had gone half a block when it began moving, slowly, keeping exactly the same distance behind her, neither speeding up nor falling back. Josie walked faster. It did too. She turned onto a narrow side street, one hand tightening around the strap of her bag, and she was calculating how far she still had to go before reaching a place with brighter streetlights, when another beam of headlights swept in from behind. A second car pulled to the curb directly in front of her. The sedan behind her slowed, backed away, turned around at the intersection, and disappeared. The rear door of the second car opened. Angelo Russo stepped out without saying anything, simply holding the door open and waiting. Josie stood motionless on the sidewalk, her heart pounding. How long has he had someone following me? Angelo kept one hand on the door. Since the night he saw you sitting on the floor of the records room, Miss Barlow. Josie looked at him. Then she looked toward the intersection where the other car had disappeared. She got in. The envelope was delivered to the third-floor apartment on Tuesday afternoon, with no stamp, no postmark, only her name handwritten across the front. Inside was a thick stack of papers, clear photocopies, without a single line blacked out. Josie sat down on the floor right there in the apartment hallway and began to read. There was the civil settlement, with all 3 signatures intact. There was the police interview report. There was the scene report, something she had never once been allowed to hold in her own hands, because the copy they had sent her back then contained only a summary of the final findings. And there was the name she had spent more than a year searching for inside that 39-story building, Whitaker Ashford. She read it 3 times before the name finally settled inside her mind. Then she turned to the final page of the settlement, to the notary seal, and beside it was the name of a law office. And beside that name was a signature she didn't recognize, but on the line beneath it the document clearly stated whom that firm represented. Castellano. Josie sat on the hallway floor until the motion sensor lights went dark and came back on twice. The next morning she went to the top floor, and this time Angelo didn't rise from his desk. He only looked at the envelope in her hand, then lowered his eyes. And Josie understood that he already knew. She pushed open the door, walked in, and placed the papers on Salvatore's desk. He looked at them. He didn't need to open them. Did you know? She asked. No, but that's your father's signature. Yes. My parents died that winter. They closed the case before I was even out of the hospital. That man didn't spend a single day in prison. I asked questions. I went to the court. I went to the lawyers. I filed 2 requests for the records, and both were denied. Her voice remained level, and that was the most frightening part. Then I spent more than a year inside your building just trying to find this name, and it turns out it was here from the beginning. Kept here because your father wanted it. Kept here. Salvatore said nothing. What are you going to say to me? She asked. He looked up at her. Nothing. You're not going to explain? No. You're not going to apologize? An apology from me won't change anything in those papers. He rose from his chair. I didn't know about this until last week. That is the truth, and it is the only thing I can give you. You have every right not to believe me. Josie looked at him for a very long time. She had come upstairs carrying an anger that had burned through her all night, and she had expected him to deny it, to soften it, to say the things wealthy men always said, and she had prepared herself for every one of them. She hadn't prepared for this. "Do you know what the worst part is?" she said. "I believe you." She placed her employee badge on the desk beside the papers. "And I still can't stay here." She walked out of the office, took the elevator down, crossed the ground floor lobby, and stepped through the glass doors without looking back even once. 3 days later, she went to the hospital to begin the paperwork to move her grandmother to the public facility. The doctor in charge of end-of-life care sat across from her holding the file, and he didn't circle around what he had to say. "Miss Barlow, I need to be direct with you about something." "Yes." "Your grandmother is on continuous oxygen now. Her numbers this week are worse than they were last week." He lowered the paper onto the desk. "That drive is 90 minutes, not counting the time it will take to complete the transfer at both ends." "What are you saying, doctor?" "I'm saying I can't promise you she will make it there." Josie sat completely still. "I can sign the transfer if you ask me to," he said, "but I won't recommend it." She thanked him. She walked out into the hallway and sat down in one of the plastic chairs lined against the wall, and she stayed there for a very long time. She had walked away from that man's desk believing she would never accept another thing from that family name for as long as she lived, and now she understood that she didn't have that choice. At the end of the hallway was the door to room 412, where her grandmother lay, being kept there by the money of a man who carried the same name as the family that had taken her parents from her. Josie bent forward, covered her face with both hands, and remained that way until a nurse passing by stopped and asked whether she was all right. Josie got home close to 9 o'clock that night. Nell was standing in the middle of the living room, still wearing her coat, and the moment the door opened, her younger sister turned and began signing, fast and precise. Someone sat in Mom's place. Josie stopped in the doorway. The living room lights were on. Nell's bedroom door was still closed exactly as it had been when the two sisters left that morning, untouched. Josie's wallet was still on the dining table, where she had forgotten it the day before, and not a single bill was missing. Nell's laptop was still plugged in at the corner of the table. No drawer had been opened. Nothing in the apartment had been taken. There was only one thing: their mother's upright piano, the old instrument against the wall that no one had touched in all those years, had been opened. The white cloth that normally covered it had been folded into a perfect square and placed neatly on the bench. The keys lay exposed beneath the light, yellowed with age, wiped clean of dust. On the music stand was a sheet of paper folded in half. Josie walked closer. She read it without picking it up. "Miss Barlow, there are some doors you shouldn't knock on. Go back to your life." She stood there for a very long time. Then she turned and looked at her sister, who had remained in the same place the entire time, and Josie realized that Nell had come home first, had walked into this room alone, and had stood there waiting for her sister, without being able to hear a single sound from the hallway outside. Josie crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her. She held her tighter than necessary, and she held on for a long time. And when she finally let go, her hands were shaking so badly that it took several seconds before she could sign again. "It's all right. I promise. It's all right." Neither sister slept that night. They moved the bench back into place, closed the piano lid, covered it with the cloth, and sat at the kitchen table until morning. Josie didn't call anyone, but someone else had. At 2 o'clock that morning, in a low building near the harbor, the door to Gideon Falco's office opened without a knock. 4 men sitting inside immediately rose to their feet. Angelo Ruzzo lifted one hand, and all 4 sat down again. Salvatore walked straight in and placed a folded sheet of paper on the desk, a photograph of the note still resting on the music stand inside a third-floor apartment on the north side of the city. Gideon Falco looked at it. He was a man who had stood beside Salvatore's father since before Salvatore could walk, and he carried the calm of someone who believed he had lived too long to be afraid of anyone. "It's a small thing," Gideon said. "No one touched anybody. It was only a message. You went into someone's home, didn't take anything. There was a girl in that house who can't hear someone outside the door." Gideon shrugged. "So what? Nothing happened to her." Salvatore didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. And the men who had worked with him long enough knew that the moment he lowered it was the moment they should worry. "My father had 3 rules," he said. "He broke 2 of them. He placed one finger on the paper. The third is the only one I kept. No one touches someone who can't defend themselves." "Kid, don't call me that." The entire room went silent. Salvatore took his phone from the inside pocket of his jacket. He made 3 calls while standing in the middle of the room, never turning his back, never lowering his voice. And none of the calls lasted more than 20 seconds. He didn't threaten anyone. He only said a name, gave a contract number, and said 2 words: Terminate it. Then he put the phone away and walked out. Angelo was the one who closed the door behind him. By the following morning, Gideon Falco had nothing left in that city. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Josie was still sitting at the kitchen table with the file spread open in front of her. She had read it many times over the past several days, but this time she read the part she had never been allowed to hold before, the scene report. Those dry pages listing one item after another beneath printed headings: point of impact, direction of travel, condition of the vehicles. Then she reached a line near the bottom of the page. Road conditions. Dry. Josie read it again. Dry. She sat up straighter. She remembered very clearly that it had been raining that night. She remembered the sound of the windshield wipers. Remembered her mother complaining that the road was slick. Remembered her father saying they were almost home. But nowhere in this entire file, from the police report to the settlement agreement, was there a single word about rain. Because rain would have changed the way fault was assigned. Because someone had needed that night to be dry on paper. And then a sentence she had barely heard at the gala, spoken while she had been shaking too badly to catch the second half, suddenly rose inside her mind, complete down to every word. You couldn't even hold on to that hand on that rainy night. Josie sat perfectly still. There was only one kind of person who could have known it had been raining that night, when every piece of paper in this file said otherwise. She found Camille Ashford the following afternoon in the parking lot behind an art gallery on Newbury Street. Camille saw her coming and didn't look surprised. You read it. I did. Then you know you should leave this city. Who was driving that car? Camille stopped half a step short. The name is in the file. I asked who was driving. Didn't you hear me? It was raining that night, Josie said. The report says the road was dry. Not one document in that file mentions rain. But at the gala, you stood beside me and talked about that rainy night. Camille said nothing. How did you know? A very long silence settled over the parking lot. My brother confessed. Camille said. I know. Whitaker Ashford. How old was he then? He was very young. Did he have a record? No. So he was the perfect person to sit in that seat, wasn't he? Camille turned her face away. You don't understand what happened. Then tell me. I was 26. I had just left a party. She stopped. It was raining and I couldn't see anything. Josie stood motionless. My father called people he knew that same night, Camille said. Whitaker sat in the living room and listened while my father talked it through with them. Then he stood up and said he had been driving. And you? I was upstairs. Josie felt something inside her chest turn to ice. Who was your father's contact? Camille didn't answer. Who was it? You already know. I want to hear you say it. Emilio Castellano. The parking lot went silent. My family paid a price for it, Camille said. Her voice almost drained of strength. Not in money. He didn't want money. He wanted something else. What? Camille looked up at her. Me, she said. The engagement was the price. 2 families. People called it a business arrangement. It was agreed that same winter. Josie had to brace one hand against the side of a car. He didn't know, Camille continued. Salvatore knew nothing about it. He had just buried his mother. His father arranged everything and told him it was a matter between the 2 families, and Salvatore let him handle it. For the entire 2 years he wore that ring. He never knew what had been paid for it. Josie could hear her own breathing. You let your brother sit in that seat, she said. Then you wore a ring that was paid for with my parents. And that night you still walked onto a stage and called my name in front of 300 people. I was afraid, Camille said it very softly. For 6 years, there hasn't been a single night when I haven't been afraid. Josie looked at the woman standing in front of her. My parents were afraid too, she said, during the last few moments they had. Then she turned and walked away. After that afternoon in the parking lot on Newbury Street, Salvatore Castellano disappeared. No phone call, no message. Josie went to the hospital every day. And every day she glanced toward the door of room 412 once, twice, then blamed herself for looking. By the 4th day, she began telling herself that this was only reasonable. The man had just lost an engagement, had just learned what his father had done, and now everything connected to her brought him nothing but trouble. By the 7th day, she thought about Grant. He had come twice too, and then stopped. He had never given her a proper goodbye either, only a message several days later. Josie sat on the bus that night and told herself she had learned this lesson once before, and she shouldn't be surprised to have to learn it again. By the 11th day, she stopped looking toward the door altogether. On the 12th day, Angelo Ruzzo found her in the hospital hallway and handed her a printed sheet of paper. It was a copy of a receipt confirming the submission of documents to the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. That was where Salvatore had spent those 11 days, sitting in a windowless room across from Deputy United States Attorney Miriam Halloran and 2 investigators, placing everything he had on the table. Not only the accident file, everything. 20 years of records from the financial channel the Ashford family had operated for the Castellano family. Transfers, shell companies, names. Miss Halloran spent 2 days reading through all of it before she finally looked up. "You understand what this means, Mr. Castellano? Tell me. If you give this to me, I will have to use it to charge you too. Not only your father, he's dead. You're the one still alive, and you've been running this operation for years." She tapped one finger against the file. "There will be no deal. I won't take a single month off whatever sentence applies. Do you understand?" "I understand. Do you have an attorney sitting beside you?" "No. You should. I don't want anyone stopping me." Miss Halloran set down her pen. She had been doing this work long enough to know when a man was bargaining and when he wasn't, and she remained silent for a while. "Then why?" she asked. Salvatore looked at the file on the table. "Because a woman waited a very long time just to learn one name," he said. "And that name was sitting inside my house the entire time." Miss Halloran asked nothing more. She pulled the file toward herself, opened her notebook, and began writing. "The grand jury will need time," she said. "I have to present this through the proper process. You have a few weeks before I have to call you in." Salvatore stood. "Then I'll use them." Everything collapsed faster than he expected. The financial channel shut down within a week. 2 banks stopped doing business with Castellano Holdings. Then people began leaving, quietly, without arguments or confrontation, simply no longer showing up. And by the end of the month, half the people who had once called him boss were working under someone else. The name his father had left him, the name that for so many years had been enough to open every door in the city merely by being spoken, was now only a name waiting to appear on an indictment. On the final night of the month, Angelo Ruzzo came to the office on the top floor and found it nearly empty. The furniture was still there. The people were not. "What do you have left?" Angelo asked. Salvatore stood beside the window, looking down toward the harbor. He lifted his right hand and slowly turned the thin silver ring on his ring finger, a habit he had carried since he was young and had never managed to lose. "This," he said, "and an empty Saturday night." Angelo was silent for a moment. "For what?" Salvatore turned around. "To be on time," he said. This time, the following afternoon, Josie went to the hospital alone. She pulled a chair close to the bed, took her grandmother's hand, and told her everything. There was no fiancé. There never had been. The man she had been talking about for the past 2 years was someone she had invented, beginning the first time her grandmother was hospitalized and kept asking who would take care of the 2 sisters after she was gone. Josie told her what she had spent more than a year searching for inside that building. She told her about the morning when 3 black cars had been waiting outside. Miss Winnie listened to all of it without interrupting once. When Josie finished, the old woman was silent for so long that Josie began to feel afraid. Then Miss Winnie gently patted the back of her granddaughter's hand. "I knew from the beginning, sweetheart." Josie's head snapped up. "What did you say?" "My lungs are failing. My eyes aren't." "How long have you known?" "Since the summer before last, the year you started telling me about him." Josie sat there stunned. "But how?" "For 2 years you told me about that man," Miss Winnie said. "And not once did you ever tell me about his hands." "His hands? You're your mother's daughter, and your mother was my daughter-in-law." The old woman gave a small shrug. "This family reads people by their hands, sweetheart. Do you remember where your grandfather's hands were calloused? Do you remember how your father's hands shook every time he had to speak in front of a crowd? You told me about a man for 2 whole years, and that man didn't have hands." A choked laugh escaped Josie. "Then why didn't you say anything?" "I was waiting for you to tell me." "You waited 2 years?" "I waited until I couldn't wait anymore." Miss Winnie looked toward the door. "Then the doctor told me what he had to tell me. So I invited Father Doyle to bless me." "No." The old woman turned back toward her granddaughter. "I invited Father Doyle to make you tell the truth. I know how stubborn you are. I knew you wouldn't be able to keep lying in front of him. I figured you would walk in here alone, have yourself a good cry, and then it would be over. I even had tissues ready in the drawer." She let out a breath. "I wasn't expecting a crime boss to walk into my room." Josie laughed and cried at the same time. "You knew who he was?" "Not right away." Miss Winnie was quiet for a moment. "But I knew the ring." "What ring?" "The silver ring on his right hand." The old woman looked down at her own hands, at the knuckles that had been swollen for years. "I didn't remember his face. I worked as a seamstress in the North End for nearly 40 years. Half that neighborhood passed through my hands. How could I remember the face of some teenage boy sitting at the back of a church? But I remembered the ring." "Why would you remember that?" "Because I had to redo the neckline of a dress 3 times because of it." Miss Winnie gave a faint laugh. "Rosaria Castellano. She taught piano to the children downstairs at the church. I made her recital dresses for years. The year she was given that ring, she wore it constantly, even when she played, and every time she lifted her hand toward the keys, it caught on the lace at her collar. I had to take the neckline apart and sew it again 3 times before I finally got it right. The old woman paused. It was the piece of work I was proudest of in all my years of sewing. Josie couldn't say a word. "Tell him something for me," Miss Winnie said. "What?" "Tell him his mother wasn't angry." Josie went rigid. "That last evening," the old woman said. "I was there. I sat in the second pew. After everyone else had gone home, I stayed with her for a while, because 2 old women had nowhere they needed to hurry off to." She looked at the empty seat beside her and said, "My boy is busy. He's building something." Miss Winnie looked directly into her granddaughter's eyes. "She said it with pride, sweetheart, not sadness. I heard her perfectly, and I have never mistaken one for the other in my life." Josie had to lower her head for a while before she could look up again. The old woman tightened her grip on her hand. "There's one more thing I want to tell you, and then I'm done." "Yes, Grandma. I never needed you to find a man before I died, but you kept asking." "I asked because I was afraid you would live alone, believing you weren't worth anyone staying for." Miss Winnie paused. "I only needed to know that you understood one thing. Being loved should never require you to make yourself smaller. Not your dreams, not your laughter, not any part of you." Josie came home very late that night. Nell was asleep. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened her phone, and found the voice message she had kept for all those years, without ever once daring to press play. She pressed it. Her mother's voice filled the dark kitchen. She only asked what the girls were having for dinner that night, said she had bought the wrong kind of bread, and reminded Josie to bring a coat because the weather report said it was turning cold. Her father's voice said something in the background. Then it ended. Josie sat motionless, her shoulders trembling, without making a sound. Then she stood, walked into the living room, pulled the white cloth from her mother's piano, opened the lid, and placed both hands on the keys. 3 days later, Salvatore came to the hospital in the morning. He brought no flowers. He walked straight to the bedside, and to the astonishment of both women in the room, he lowered himself onto one knee beside the bed, not facing Josie, but facing the old woman. "I would like to ask your permission." Miss Winnie placed a hand on the side of the bed. "Permission for what?" "I want to marry your granddaughter. You know you're about to go away." "I know. For how long?" "I don't know yet. They haven't told me, but I wasn't going to hide that from you." The old woman looked at him for a very long time. "The girl will have to wait." "Yes, ma'am." "Are you planning to tell her not to wait?" "No. I'm not going to tell her what she should do. She decides for herself." Miss Winnie nodded, then turned toward Josie. Salvatore reached into his coat and took out a small box. Inside there was no diamond, only a thin, plain gold ring, and one side of the band had been widened into an unusual shape. He slipped it onto the ring finger of Josie's left hand, the finger that had refused to straighten for all those years, and it fit perfectly. He had given the measurements to the jeweler, and he had done it before the day he sat in that windowless room across from Miss Halloran. Josie couldn't say a word. Miss Winnie leaned back against the pillows and let out a long breath. "Now I can stop worrying." The old woman passed away on a Thursday morning in her sleep, so peacefully that the nurse on duty had to check twice before she dared make the call. The photograph taken in room 412 had been placed neatly on her chest. She must have taken it from the drawer the night before. When Josie came to complete the paperwork, a nurse handed her the visitor sign-in book for the ward. Josie turned the pages backward one by one. Throughout those final weeks, every single day had a signature in the evening column, always during the hours when Josie had to leave for her night shift. A. Rezzo. A. Rezzo. A. Rezzo. Every day. Not one missed. Not one of them had ever mentioned it to her. That afternoon, Nell packed up their grandmother's belongings, and beneath the hospital bed she found a cardboard box tied with string. Inside was Miss Winnie's wedding dress, the dress she had worn when she married their grandfather, old now and faded to ivory. But the entire dress had been taken apart and sewn again, altered to fit Josie's measurements. The left sleeve had been cut shorter than the right, deliberately, neatly, and carefully finished along the edge. And running along that exact place, her grandmother had sewn a row of tiny pearls, one at a time, with the same trembling hands that had no longer been able to thread a needle. Inside the box was a piece of paper folded into quarters. Written on it were the words, "I didn't sew it to hide it. I sewed it so people would have to look." That same day, Salvatore Castellano turned himself in. 2 winters later, on the ground floor of St. Aloysius Hospital, there was a small room open every day of the week, its door painted pale yellow, with a bronze plaque above it engraved with the words Winifred Barlow Music Room. Inside stood an old piano against the wall, and anyone could come in without paying a thing. Patients came in, families came in, and 3 afternoons each week, Children from the neighborhood came to learn, children who played in their own ways, some with more fingers, some with fewer, some using both hands, some using only one. Josie taught there. She no longer hid her left hand in her pocket. One afternoon, a little boy who had spent the entire previous week sitting at the keyboard finally managed to play his first complete chord, and the sound rang full and clear through the little room. The boy spun around with a grin stretching from ear to ear. "Miss Josie, that means I know how to play piano now, right?" "You know how to play piano now," Josie said. The whole room applauded. Nell stood at the back of the room with one hand resting on the piano lid so she could feel the vibration traveling through the wood, and she smiled. Then the pale yellow door opened. A man walked in wearing an old coat worn at the elbows, his hair touched with much more gray than before. Alone, with no one beside him and no black car waiting outside, he stood in the doorway for a moment. Josie looked up, and she didn't rise. She only looked at him and smiled, and he walked over and sat down on the chair to her left. The story of Josephine Barlow and Salvatore Castellano reminds us that a person's dignity has never depended on their job, their possessions, or whether their body remains whole. No one has to carry the sins of their father, but everyone must choose what they will do with the things they inherit. Some people use power to make others feel smaller, and some people use power simply to sit quietly beside them. And real love has never asked anyone to hide the part of themselves that is imperfect. Sometimes it simply widens the ring so it will fit. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so that every day more meaningful stories can find their way to you. How did this story make you feel? Please leave a few words in the comments below. We truly hope to hear what comes from deep within your heart. We wish you lasting health, happiness, and peace in every day of your life. Goodbye for now, and we will see you again in the next video.